The metal tube was awkward, ungainly, and looked more like a piece of industrial plumbing than a weapon of war. At nearly a meter long and weighing 15 kilograms, it resembled a stubby mortar or an oversized drain pipe with a crude trigger mechanism bolted to its side. Soldiers who first encountered it often wondered if someone was playing a practical joke. This couldn't possibly be the new anti-tank weapon they'd been promised. But Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada knew better. On the night of 21st October 1944, along the flood-swollen Savio River in northern Italy, Smith crouched in a muddy ditch, clutching one of these ungainly tubes. A Piat, the projector, infantry, anti-tank. The rain was torrential. The river had risen 6 feet in 5 hours, cutting off the Canadian bridgehead from tank and artillery support. And now, rumbling through the darkness, came the unmistakable sound of German armor. Panther tanks, perhaps the most deadly fighting vehicles in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. Smith waited. The Piat had an effective range of barely 30 meters against armor. Any farther and the bomb might not penetrate. Any closer and, well, there was no closer. This was going to be point blank. The lead Panther rolled down the muddy road, its machine guns blazing, searching for targets. At 10 meters, 30 feet, Smith stood up, exposed himself completely to enemy fire, and pulled the Piat's heavy trigger. The weapon bucked violently against his shoulder. The bomb struck the Panther's side armor. The explosion disabled the tank. German infantry jumped off the back of the vehicle, charging Smith with submachine guns and grenades. Without hesitation, Smith grabbed his Tommy gun and killed 4 of them at point-blank range, driving the rest back. When another Panther tried to advance, Smith grabbed another Piat and damaged it enough to force a retreat. For his actions that night, Smith would receive the Victoria Cross, the only Canadian private soldier in the Second World War to earn the Commonwealth's highest award for valor. And the Piat, that ugly, brutal, difficult weapon, would cement its reputation as one of the war's most feared anti-tank tools. This is the story of how an unlikely weapon, designed in secret workshops, produced in Canadian factories, and wielded by soldiers from the prairies and the Maritimes, became a nightmare for German tank crews across occupied Europe. It's the story of the Piat, the crazy Canadian pipe that could kill a Panther. The Piat's origins lie in Britain's desperate situation after Dunkirk. In June 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had escaped from France, but left behind nearly all its heavy equipment. The army was essentially starting from scratch, and one of its most pressing problems was how to give infantry soldiers a fighting chance against German tanks. The standard British anti-tank weapon in 1940 was the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a powerful weapon that could penetrate 25 millimeters of armor from half a kilometer away. But German tank design was evolving rapidly. By 1941, the Tigers and Panthers rolling off production lines had frontal armor exceeding 100 millimeters. The Boy's rifle couldn't touch them. What infantry needed was a weapon that could penetrate heavy armor, could be carried by a single soldier or small team, and didn't require the massive recoil mechanisms of traditional anti-tank guns. The answer came from an unlikely source, the spigot mortar principle. Instead of firing a projectile down a barrel, a spigot mortar worked in reverse. A rod or spigot was projected into a hollow projectile, igniting a propellant charge that blew the projectile off the spigot and toward the target. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker of the Royal Artillery had been experimenting with spigot designs since before the war. He'd developed the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar that could launch a 9-kilogram bomb about 90 meters. It was effective against fortifications, but too large and cumbersome for infantry use. Blacker's vision was to scale the concept down into a handheld weapon. The breakthrough came when Major Millis Jeffries entered the picture. Jeffries was a sapper, a combat engineer, and the commander of a secret weapons development facility known as MD1, colloquially called Churchill's Toy Shop. Earl. This clandestine operation, with Winston Churchill's personal backing, developed unconventional weapons for special operations and irregular warfare. Jeffries took Blacker's spigot mortar concept and combined it with shape charge technology to create a weapon that could penetrate tank armor. Shape charges were a relatively recent innovation. The principle, discovered as far back as 1888 but only fully developed in the 1930s, was elegant. A hollow cone lined with metal and backed by explosive. When detonated, the explosive force focused into a jet of superheated metal, moving at tremendous velocity, capable of burning through steel armor like a blowtorch through butter. The beauty of shaped charges was that velocity didn't matter. Penetration depended on the explosive force, not the speed at which the projectile hit the target. This meant the weapon didn't need to fire its bomb at high speed, it just needed to get it to the target. Jeffries's prototype, initially called the shoulder gun, combined a spring-loaded spigot system with a shaped charge bomb. Trials at the Bisley Small Arms School were dramatic. A warrant officer test-fired the weapon and successfully penetrated armored targets, but a piece of metal from the explosion wounded him. Jeffries himself then took over, firing several more rounds successfully without injury. The design worked. The Ordnance Board was impressed. They ordered improvements to the ammunition to prevent fragments from injuring the user, renamed the weapon the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, abbreviated to PIAT, and authorized production. By the end of August 1942, PIATs were coming off assembly lines at Imperial Chemical Industries and other manufacturers. Canada would also produce significant numbers at facilities in Orillia, Ontario, contributing to the weapon's widespread deployment across Commonwealth forces. The PIAT that entered service in 1943 was an unusual-looking device. It consisted of a metal tube with an open trough at the front for loading the bomb, a large padded butt plate at the rear, and a massive trigger guard housing a two-finger trigger. Inside the tube was an enormous coiled spring, the heart of the weapon. When cocked, this spring was under tremendous tension. Pulling the trigger released the spring, which drove a spigot rod forward into the base of the bomb. The spigot struck an explosive cartridge containing 52 grains of cordite in the bomb's tail, and the resulting explosion launched the bomb toward the target at about 80 meters per second, quite slow compared to conventional projectiles, but sufficient for the shaped charge to work. The bomb itself weighed about 1 kilogram and contained a hollow, cone-shaped charge. On impact, the charge detonated, creating a jet of molten metal that could penetrate up to 100 millimeters of armor. Against German tanks, this was sufficient to disable or destroy most vehicles if the shot hit properly. The weapon had an effective direct fire range of about 100 meters against tanks and could be used in an indirect fire role, essentially as a mortar, out to 300 meters for attacking buildings or fortifications. For Commonwealth infantry soldiers, the PIAT represented a significant leap in capability. Unlike the American bazooka or German Panzerschreck rocket launchers, the PIAT had no backblast. Rockets produced a dramatic flame and smoke signature from the rear when fired, which revealed the shooter's position and could injure friendly soldiers standing behind. The PIAT's spring-powered system produced no backblast, no smoke signature, and could be fired safely from inside a building, a crucial advantage in urban warfare. This made it ideal for ambushes and defensive positions where concealment mattered. But the PIAT was not an easy weapon to use. Its single greatest challenge was the cocking mechanism. Before the first shot, the operator had to manually cock the enormous spring. The procedure was awkward. Unlatch the shoulder pad, stand on it, give the weapon a half-turn to unlock the body, then lift the weapon straight up. The spring required a 90-kilogram pull, about 200 pounds of force, You had to use your entire body weight and leg strength to compress that spring until you heard a click indicating it was cocked. Then you'd reattach the shoulder pad with another half turn, load a bomb, raise the weapon to your shoulder and take aim. This process required standing up, making you an obvious target. In combat, PIAT crews would try to cock the weapon under cover before an engagement, but if they needed to reload after a shot, the cocking procedure became extremely dangerous. The weapon was designed so that the recoil from firing would automatically re-cock the spring for the next shot, in theory. In practice, there was a slight delay between pulling the trigger and the bomb launching. Inexperienced operators often released their grip too early, preventing the automatic recocking. If that happened, you had to stand up and manually cock the weapon again while under fire. The recoil was legendary. Soldiers described it as brutal, capable of bruising shoulders or even breaking collarbones if the weapon wasn't held firmly. The trigger itself required considerable force. You needed 2 fingers to pull it properly. And there was always that fraction of a second delay after pulling the trigger while the spring drove forward, which could throw off your aim if you weren't expecting it. Despite these challenges, Canadian troops embraced the PIAT. In a survey conducted by the Canadian Army in 1944-45, 161 officers who had recently left combat were questioned about the effectiveness of 31 different infantry weapons. The PIAT was ranked the most outstandingly effective weapon, ahead even of the beloved Bren gun. This wasn't just theoretical, it reflected real combat experience. Canadian soldiers had learned to use the PIAT's unique characteristics to their advantage. The weapon's first combat use came during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Canadian troops of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division were among the first to employ PIATs in action. The initial experience was mixed. Early production bombs had a reliability problem. They would misfire if they struck the target at anything other than a perpendicular angle. This undermined confidence in the weapon. Imagine stalking a German tank, waiting for it to come within effective range, exposing yourself to fire the weapon, pulling the trigger, and having the bomb bounce off harmlessly because it hit at a slight angle. The fault was corrected, but it took time to restore soldiers' trust in the PIAT. By the time Canadian forces landed at Ortona in December 1943, the PIAT had been improved and soldiers had learned how to employ it effectively. In the brutal street fighting for that Italian coastal town, later called Canada's Little Stalingrad, PIATs proved invaluable not just as anti-tank weapons, but in urban warfare roles. The weapon could blow holes through the thick stone walls of Italian buildings, creating breaches for infantry to assault through. This versatility made the PIAT essential for the house-to-house fighting that characterized the Battle of Ortona. Canadian PIAT crews developed tactics suited to the weapon's characteristics. Because it had such short range, successful employment required patience, nerve, and understanding of terrain. You had to let the enemy tank get close, terrifyingly close. 30 meters was ideal. Any farther, and penetration became uncertain. This meant positioning yourself in ambush locations, ditches alongside roads, behind walls, inside buildings with good fields of fire. You'd wait, motionless, while several tons of German armor rumbled toward you, and only fire when you could practically reach out and touch it. The lack of backblast signature meant you could fire, then immediately relocate before the enemy figured out where the shot came from. Canadian soldiers became adept at these hit-and-run tactics. Fire from a building, then move to a different room or different building entirely before the Germans could respond. The PIAT allowed a kind of mobile, concealed anti-tank warfare that rocket launchers couldn't match. The weapon's indirect fire capability also proved useful. By rotating the shoulder stock 90 degrees and wedging the PIAT into a solid foundation, a wall, a tree, a pile of rubble, You could fire it like a mortar, lobbing bombs in an arc toward targets you couldn't see directly. This house-breaking role allowed Piat teams to attack German strongpoints, demolish fortified buildings, or suppress enemy positions at ranges up to 300 meters. During fighting in Normandy and the Netherlands, Canadian infantry used Piats this way when artillery support wasn't available or was too close to their own positions. Training emphasized the importance of working in teams. While the Piat could theoretically be operated by a single soldier, in practice it was almost always assigned to a two-man crew, one operator and one loader, ammunition carrier. The bombs were heavy, about 1 kilogram each, and bulky. Carrying the Piat itself plus multiple bombs quickly became exhausting. Having a second man to carry ammunition, provide security, and assist with reloading under fire made the difference between an effective weapon system and a cumbersome liability. Canadian Piat crews also learned to coordinate with riflemen. The standard tactic was for the Piat team to position itself in a concealed location with good fields of fire, while rifle sections provided overwatch and security. If a German tank appeared, the rifleman would suppress any accompanying infantry with fire, allowing the Piat crew to focus on the armor. After the Piat shot, riflemen would cover the crew's withdrawal or provide protection while they prepared for a second shot. This integration of the Piat into infantry tactics reflected the broader Canadian approach to warfare, combined arms at the smallest level with every element supporting the others. The Piat wasn't just an anti-tank weapon. It was part of an integrated system of infantry weapons working together tactically. As Canadian forces pushed through France and into the Netherlands in 1944, Piat teams faced increasingly sophisticated German armor. The Tigers and Panthers were formidable opponents, heavily armored, powerfully armed, and crewed by experienced tankers who knew how to use terrain and tactics to their advantage, but Piats kept knocking them out. A British analysis of the Normandy campaign found that 7% of all German tanks destroyed by British and Commonwealth forces were knocked out by Piats, more than were destroyed by aircraft-fired rockets. For a hand-carried infantry weapon, this was a remarkable achievement. Part of the Piat's effectiveness came from its unpredictability. German tank commanders knew about bazookas and understood their capabilities and limitations. But the Piat, with its unusual spring-powered mechanism and lack of firing signature, often caught them by surprise. A tank crew might be advancing cautiously, watching for the telltale smoke trail of a bazooka rocket, when suddenly their vehicle would be hit by a Piat bomb from a position they hadn't even identified. The psychological effect was significant. German tankers learned to fear the invisible threat of Piats concealed in ditches, buildings, hedgerows. The weapon also found its way beyond Commonwealth forces. Under the Anglo-Soviet Military Supplies Agreement, the Soviet Union received 1,000 Piats and 100,000 rounds of ammunition by March 1946. More significantly, Piats were supplied to resistance forces throughout occupied Europe. In Poland, the Home Army used Piats during the desperate Warsaw Uprising of August-October 1944. For resistance fighters with limited heavy weapons, the Piats' ability to engage German armor gave them a fighting chance. In occupied France, French resistance forces employed Piats in the absence of mortars or artillery, using them against both tanks and fortified positions. The sight of resistance fighters wielding Piats against German occupation forces added to the weapon's fearsome reputation. For civilians in occupied territories, the Piat represented hope, proof that even the most heavily armored German vehicles could be defeated by determined fighters with the right tools. For German forces, it represented a persistent threat. You couldn't suppress resistance by armor alone when the resistance possessed weapons capable of destroying your tanks. The Piat's reputation was built not just on statistics, but on individual acts of extraordinary courage. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions involving the weapon, an unprecedented number for a single infantry weapon system. Each of these stories reveals something about what made the Piat both terrifying to face and demanding to use. Beyond Smoky Smith's legendary action at the Savio River, there was Fusilier Frank Jefferson of the Lancashire Fusiliers. On 16th of May 1944, during the grinding Italian campaign's assault on the Gustav Line, Jefferson's unit came under fierce German counterattack led by a Panzer IV tank. Jefferson grabbed a Piat, advanced under heavy fire, and destroyed the tank at close range. His action broke the German counterattack and allowed his company to hold their position. The citation for his Victoria Cross noted his magnificent courage and utter disregard for his own safety. Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis earned his Victoria Cross on D-Day itself, 6th of June 1944, for multiple actions, one of which involved using a Piat to attack a German field gun position. Hollis was the only man to receive the Victoria Cross for actions on D-Day, and his aggressive use of the Piat exemplified how Commonwealth soldiers employed the weapon not just defensively, but as an offensive tool to destroy enemy positions and keep attacks moving forward. Perhaps most remarkable was the action of Rifleman Ganju Lama of the 7th Gurkha Rifles. On 12th of June 1944, at Ningthukong in Burma, Lama's position came under attack by 2 Japanese tanks. Despite being badly wounded, Lama crawled forward with his Piat to within 30 yards of the lead tank. He destroyed it with his first shot. As Japanese infantry counterattacked, he engaged them with grenades while preparing another Piat bomb. When the second tank tried to advance, he destroyed it as well, despite losing consciousness from blood loss immediately afterward. The citation described his action as showing heroism, determination, and a complete disregard for his own safety. These weren't soldiers engaging targets at safe distances with sophisticated weapon systems. These were men who had to let enemy tanks close to within a few dozen meters. Close enough to see the crews inside, close enough to be killed by a single burst of machine gun fire before they could effectively engage. The courage required was extraordinary, and the Piat demanded it consistently. For Canadian soldiers specifically, the Piat became particularly associated with the Italian campaign. The mountainous terrain, the narrow valleys, the towns perched on hilltops, all of this favored defenders and made conventional anti-tank guns difficult to position effectively. Piats, carried by 2-man crews who could move through rough terrain and set up quickly in buildings or behind walls, were ideal for this environment. During the advance through the Liri Valley toward Rome in spring 1944, Canadian Piat teams repeatedly engaged German armor in close-quarters fighting. The valleys were so narrow and the terrain so broken that tanks were often channelized onto roads or restricted to specific routes. Canadian infantry would position Piats in ambush locations, wait for German armor to advance into the kill zone, then engage at point-blank range. The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. For the Piat crew, waiting as tons of steel rumbled closer. For the tank crew, knowing that any building, any pile of rubble, any hedgerow could conceal a weapon capable of killing them. The weapon's versatility extended beyond pure anti-tank work. In the fighting around the Gothic Line in autumn 1944, Canadian forces used Piats extensively in their house-breaking role. German defensive positions in Italian villages were often centered on thick-walled stone buildings that were difficult to destroy with small arms or even artillery. Piat teams would move into position, wedge the weapon at an angle to give it an arcing trajectory, and lob bombs onto or into German strongpoints. The shaped charge warheads, while designed for armor penetration, were also devastatingly effective against fortifications. A Piat bomb could blow a hole through a meter-thick stone wall, creating an entry point for assault troops or simply collapsing the structure on its defenders. Back in Canada, factories were producing Piats at a steady pace. The Aurelia facility in Ontario turned out thousands of weapons and bombs throughout 1944. Workers, many of them women who had taken over industrial jobs as men went overseas, assembled the spring mechanisms, fitted the tubes, tested the triggers. Each weapon that came off the production line represented Canadian industrial capacity contributing directly to the war effort. The Piat was tangible proof that Canada wasn't just sending soldiers, it was producing the tools those soldiers needed to fight effectively. For families in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, cities and towns across Canada, the Piat became a symbol recognized from newsreels and newspaper photographs. Images of Canadian soldiers in Italy or France carrying the distinctive tube-shaped weapon appeared regularly in Canadian media. When Smokey Smith received his Victoria Cross, the story of how he'd used a Piat to destroy a Panther tank was told and retold across the country. The weapon became part of Canada's war narrative, alongside the Bren gun, the Lee Enfield rifle, and other iconic equipment. The harsh reality, of course, was that using a Piat in combat was terrifying, exhausting work. Veterans' accounts consistently describe the physical and psychological demands. The weapon was heavy. 15 kilograms didn't sound like much until you'd carried it for kilometers through muddy fields or up Italian mountainsides. The bombs were bulky and awkward to transport. Setting up a firing position required finding cover that provided both concealment and a clear field of fire at short range. And then came the waiting, watching for targets, knowing that when one appeared, you'd have perhaps one chance to make the shot before the enemy identified your position. The recoil never got easier. Veteran Piat operators described developing bruises on their shoulders that never fully healed while they were in combat. Some learned to fire from positions where they could brace the weapon against something solid, a wall, a tree, the ground, to absorb some of the recoil. Others simply endured it, knowing that the alternative was watching enemy tanks advance unopposed. Reliability remained a concern throughout the war. While the ammunition problems of 1943 were largely resolved, Piat still had occasional failures. The spring mechanism could malfunction if damaged or if dirt got into the housing. The bomb's fuses, while improved, were still somewhat volatile. There were cases of premature detonations. After the war ended, live firing exercises with Piats were actually banned because of the ongoing concerns about ammunition safety. But during the war itself, these risks were simply accepted as part of using the weapon. German responses to the Piat threat evolved over time. By 1944, many German tanks were being fitted with armored skirts, Schürzen, specifically designed to defeat shaped charge weapons. These thin metal plates hung around the sides and rear of the tank, positioned several centimeters away from the main armor. When a shaped charge round hit a Schürzen, it would detonate prematurely, before the jet of molten metal could reach the actual tank armor. This significantly reduced Piat effectiveness. British analysis found that once Schürzen became common, Piats became much less effective against the tanks that carried them. But the armored skirts couldn't protect everywhere. The rear of the turret, the engine deck, the tracks, these remained vulnerable. Canadian Piat crews adapted their tactics, trying to maneuver for flank or rear shots where the skirts didn't provide protection. This required even more patience and tactical skill, waiting for the tank to turn or pass by, exposing its vulnerable areas. It also required better coordination with other infantry weapons. Riflemen to suppress accompanying infantry, smoke grenades to obscure the Piat crew's movement as they repositioned for a better shot. The psychological dimension of Piat operations deserves emphasis. For the tank commander looking out through narrow vision slits, every building, every clump of vegetation, every roadside ditch was a potential Piat position. The Germans learned to be extremely cautious when advancing through areas where Commonwealth infantry might be dug in. They'd saturate suspected Piat positions with machine gun fire, call in artillery, sometimes refuse to advance at all until infantry had cleared the area on foot. This defensive mentality, this fear of the concealed anti-tank weapon, slowed German tactical mobility and gave Commonwealth forces an advantage in defensive operations. For resistance fighters in occupied Europe, the Piat represented something even more significant. These were civilians turned soldiers, often with minimal military training, facing professional German troops supported by armor. The ability to destroy a tank, to stop a German column, to defend a neighborhood against Wehrmacht assault, this changed the dynamics of resistance operations fundamentally. During the Warsaw Uprising of August-October 1944, Polish Home Army fighters used Piats supplied by Allied airdrops to engage German armor in the rubble-strewn streets. The uprising was ultimately crushed, but Piat-armed resistance fighters destroyed several German vehicles and forced the Wehrmacht to commit significant armored assets to urban fighting. Photographs from the uprising show Polish fighters, some barely out of their teens, carrying Piats through destroyed buildings, preparing ambushes, fighting with a determination born of 5 years of occupation. For them, the Piat was more than a weapon. It was a tool of liberation, proof that they could fight back against the occupiers' most powerful weapons. French resistance forces in the Maquis similarly valued Piats for operations against German convoys and strongpoints. In the mountainous regions of southern France, where conventional military operations were difficult, small groups of resistance fighters with Piats could ambush German columns, destroy vehicles, and then melt back into the terrain before reinforcements arrived. The lack of firing signature was particularly valuable. After a Piat shot, there was no smoke trail pointing back to your position, giving you precious seconds to withdraw before the Germans could respond. The Piat service extended beyond the European theatre. In Burma, Gurkha and British Indian Army units used Piats against Japanese tanks and fortifications. The jungle environment presented unique challenges. Humidity affected the spring mechanisms, and the thick vegetation made it difficult to achieve clear fields of fire at the ranges Piats needed. But the weapon's ability to fire from inside buildings or bunkers without backblast proved valuable in defensive positions. When Japanese armor attempted to break Allied lines, Piat-armed defenders could engage from prepared positions without revealing themselves until the last moment. After the war ended in May 1945, Piats remained in Commonwealth service for several more years. Canadian forces used them in occupation duties in Germany and the Netherlands. The weapon saw limited service in the Korean War, where Australian and British forces briefly deployed Piats alongside bazookas before replacing both with improved American designs. By the early 1950s, the Piat was obsolete, superseded by more sophisticated anti-tank weapons, but its legacy endured. For Canadian veterans who had carried Piats through Sicily, Italy, France, the Netherlands, the weapon remained a powerful memory. In reunions and veterans associations, stories about Piat operations were told and retold. The Victoria Crosses, awarded for Piat actions, particularly Smoky Smith's, became part of Canadian military heritage, taught to new generations of soldiers as examples of courage under fire. Today, Piats are museum pieces displayed in military collections across Canada and the Commonwealth. At the Seaforth Highlanders Museum in Vancouver, visitors can see a Piat similar to the one Smoky Smith used at the Savio River. The Juno Beach Centre in Normandy displays Piats alongside other Canadian infantry weapons, explaining their role in the D-Day landings and subsequent campaign. These preserved weapons offer a tangible connection to the past, allowing modern audiences to see and understand what Canadian soldiers actually carried into combat. What made the Piat feared wasn't its sophistication, It was crude compared to modern weapons. It wasn't its ease of use. Soldiers consistently described it as difficult and punishing. What made it feared was its effectiveness in the hands of determined soldiers. A well-trained Piat crew with good tactical positioning could destroy the most powerful German tanks. A resistance fighter with a Piat could stop a German column. An infantryman under counterattack could break up an armored assault and save his unit. The weapon represented a broader truth about infantry combat in the Second World War, that courage, training and tactical skill could overcome technological disadvantages. German tanks were superior to most Allied armor throughout the war. German tank crews were often more experienced. But Commonwealth infantry with Piats, willing to let those tanks close to 30 meters before firing, could level the playing field. It required extraordinary nerve, but it worked. For Canadian soldiers specifically, the Piat embodied their approach to warfare. Practical, determined, willing to use whatever tools were available to get the job done. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't comfortable, but it was effective. And in war, effectiveness mattered more than anything else. The story of the Piat is ultimately a story about the soldiers who used it. Men like Smokey Smith, who stood up under machine gun fire to engage a Panther at point-blank range. Men like the unnamed Piat crews, who ambushed German armor in Italian valleys, in Norman hedgerows, in Dutch towns. Resistance fighters in Warsaw and France, who used Piats to fight for their freedom. All of them wielding that ungainly metal tube, that crazy Canadian pipe, that weapon which looked like plumbing but killed like a cannon. When we remember the Piat today, we remember more than a weapon. We remember the courage it took to use it effectively. We remember the Canadian factories that produced it, the soldiers who carried it, the battles where it made the difference between defeat and victory. We remember that sometimes the most feared weapons aren't the most sophisticated ones. They're the ones in the hands of soldiers brave enough to use them at point-blank range, whatever the cost. The Piat earned its fearsome reputation one engagement at a time, one destroyed tank at a time, one act of courage at a time. And that reputation, built in the mud of Italy, the hedgerows of Normandy, the rubble of Warsaw, endures as part of Canada's proud military heritage.